Chapter 029. The Hunters and the Hunted. Considering the reputation the Great Northern Forest had among people living in more southern civilized territories, one would expect the place to be a giant death trap, with every animal and a good portion of the plants trying to kill you at every turn. The truth Zorian had found was a little more complex. While yes, the forest was full of dangerous creatures, even the deer were kind of aggressive and had tried to gore him a couple of times instead of fleeing from his approach. It was entirely possible to spend an entire day without endangering your life if you knew what you were doing. Granted, Zorian had a somewhat unfair advantage in the form of his mind sense, which let him sense a lot of the dangers before they had the chance to detect him in turn. Furthermore, the region he was frequenting was a border area, thus a little friendlier to humans than the deep, untouched wilderness in the far north. Still, he was confident that even a skilled civilian could move through the forest unmolested, much less a mage. Hell, he was doing just fine at the moment despite having less than a month of experience. Usually, Zorian wouldn't have wanted to move through the forest undetected. The whole point of going here was to get combat experience, so avoiding danger was kind of missing the point. This time, however, sneaking around was more or less mandatory. He really didn't want to get distracted around a threat on the level of a Grey Hunter, and he definitely didn't want to alert the monster that he was coming by engaging in a loud, flashy fight right next to its lair. He slowly circled the area around the Grey Hunter's lair, checking it for threats and hostile terrain that might inhibit him should he choose to retreat in any particular direction. In several places he carved clusters of explosive glyphs into the trees and exposed rocks. He doubted they were powerful enough to seriously hurt a Grey Hunter, but they might buy him a few seconds he needed to teleport away to safety. He almost succeeded in reaching the lair without a fight. Thankfully, the trio of fly mosquito whatever things that tried to ambush him were very easy to dispatch. They burned beautifully, and the fight didn't raise enough ruckus to attract the monstrous spider's attention. Zorian picked out a rather tall tree close, but not too close, to the Grey Hunter's lair and levitated himself to the upper branches, where he promptly took out the binoculars he enchanted earlier for the purpose and started studying his target. The location was actually kind of picturesque. A small rocky gully surrounded by forest, with some pretty sediment lines crisscrossing the stone and a few strategically placed clumps of grass growing between the cracks. On one of the walls stood a perfectly circular hole that served as the entrance to the cave. It was pitch black and surprisingly unremarkable and unthreatening. If Silverlake hadn't told him it was there, it was entirely possible that Zorian would have missed it entirely if he had ever stumbled into the place in one of the restarts. It would have been the last mistake he ever made, at least in that hypothetical restart. Grey Hunters were crazy good jumpers and possessed downright surreal speed. Zorian would bet anything that the one inside that cave could jump straight from the cave entrance to the other side of the gully in a single leap and close in before Zorian could so much as realize what was happening. The Grey Hunter was fundamentally a very simple monster. It was a grey furry spider the size of an adult man, and it also happened to be incredibly fast, strong, durable and spell-resistant. It could run faster than a hasted mage, jump incredible distances, shrug off regular firearms and lower-level attack spells like a duck shrugging off water, outright ignore most direct effect spells and bite through steel. Oh, and it had a very nasty poison that, instead of destroying tissue or wrecking the nervous system like most poisons, utterly disrupted a mage's ability to shape and control their mana instead. Once bitten, you wouldn't be casting anything for a while and it would take weeks for the poison to fully flush out of your system. Apparently it was a type of poison adapted specifically to bring down magical beings that were the Grey Hunter's typical prey, but it was just as effective against human mages. Basically, if you were fighting against a Grey Hunter alone and got bitten, you were done for. These things were known for chewing through entire groups of battle mages sent specifically to get rid of them. Quite a feat for what is ostensibly an animal-level creature. Most non-sapient monsters, no matter how impressive, were too easy to lure into traps to pose such a huge danger to a prepared hunting group. Naturally, Silverlake wanted him to tangle with said mage-killing super spider as her price for her help. The good news was that she hadn't asked him to kill the thing, something that Zorian suspected might be beyond him at the moment. The bad news was that her request was only a smidgen easier than that. She wanted him to confront the female Grey Hunter who laired in the cave he was currently observing and steal some of her eggs. The life cycle of Grey Hunters was a total mystery, as they were considered too dangerous to study through anything other than post-battle reports and vivisection, but Zorian was willing to bet that Grey Hunter mothers were fiercely protective of their spawn. Getting even a single egg was likely to be quite a challenge. In all likelihood, the mother would be reluctant to go far from her egg sac for any reason, so waiting for the chance to simply swipe some may be impractical or even futile. For all he knew, the female sat on her egg sac all day long and lived off her fat reserves until the young hatched. Zorian placed the binoculars back into his bag and started jotting down notes in one of the notebooks he brought with him. The question of how to acquire the eggs without getting horribly murdered in the process was ultimately a question for another time. He was currently here just to scout out the situation and see if the task was even possible. As much as he wanted to prove the shriveled old witch wrong by completing her impossible quest, dying here would be incredibly stupid. He was on a time limit. A long time limit, but repeatedly dying because he decided to take on opponents way over his level would be an unforgivable waste. Every restart cut short was a restart he wasn't using to its full potential. If he couldn't think of a way to get the eggs that he was absolutely sure would work, he wouldn't do it. And even if he could think of a way, he would only try it out near the end of the restart, when the most he would lose was a couple of days. "All right," he mumbled, snapping the notebook shut. "Let's see what I'm dealing with." The first thing he did was try to locate the Grey Hunter female to make sure she wasn't outside her lair at the moment. He had no way of tracking down Grey Hunters specifically through divination, as he had never seen one before and lacked any Grey Hunter body parts, but a simple locator spell searching for a giant spider pointed him straight at the cave. Since the other two giant spider varieties that lived in the region, giant tree spider and giant trapdoor spider respectively, didn't live in caves, the conclusion was obvious. He then tried to scry the spider, which immediately failed. Well, the spell technically worked, but the cave was totally dark. There were no glowing crystals or ember moss that occasionally lit natural caverns, just an ordinary cave full of impenetrable darkness that hid everything. Damn, he hadn't thought of that. Racking his brains for a spell combination that would allow him to scout out the lair without having to go back into the city and hit the books, he decided to combine two different spells. First, he cast the Arcane Eye spell, creating a floating ectoplasmic eyeball through which he could see remotely. He then created a floating ball of light, functionally identical to the simple floating lantern spell, except he altered the spell parameters so it would follow the ectoplasmic eye around instead of himself. He then sent the eye into the cave, closing his real eyes and connecting his sight to his remote sensor. There was a chance that the light would aggravate the Grey Hunter mother, but he doubted she would run out to confront him just for that, or that she could track him down on his tree for that matter. As it happened, the Grey Hunter was either very bothered by his floating lantern or perhaps saw it as prey, because the eye had barely advanced into the cave, floating lantern in tow, when a grey blur slammed into it and Zorian's awareness was violently wrenched back into his body. Blinking in surprise at his sudden perspective shift, Zorian was then treated to the sight of the Grey Hunter leaping out of the cave and skittering around the area in search of something. After 10 seconds or so of looking at the spider, Zorian noticed two things. First, the Grey Hunter female didn't have to sit on her egg sac all day long, because she was freaking carrying it on the underside of her abdomen. That was so freaking unfair. He withdrew everything he said about Silver Lake's task being easier than killing the thing. This was actually way harder, since he was only getting the eggs by taking them from the Grey Hunter's cooling corpse but had to be careful when killing her not to damage the likely much frailer egg sac. The second thing he noticed was that the spider was steadily getting closer to his location. It wasn't immediately noticeable. Rather than immediately making a beeline towards him, the spider shot off in a random direction for a second, stopped for a moment as if reorienting herself, and then shot off in a seemingly random direction again. It repeated the same stop and skitter routine second after second, and though the movement seemed random at first, Zorian noted with dread that it was steadily getting closer to his tree as time passed. So the murder spider also had hypersensitive senses now? This was such bullshit. How the hell had it noticed him anyway? He'd even taken the time to set up some camouflage spells and silencing wards around himself just to prevent stuff like this from happening. True, they were fairly weak in order to conserve mana, but that shouldn't have. He frowned. That was it, wasn't it? The Grey Hunter was tracking him through the wards. Its natural prey was said to be other magical creatures. It had a poison specifically designed to counter magic. Probably had some kind of innate magic sense that let it sense its prey over great distances. Rather than shielding him from the Grey Hunter, the wards he set up were revealing his location to it. The fact they were so weak was probably the only reason it hadn't divined his location instantly and was instead reduced to stumbling all over the place in an attempt to locate him. So he was in trouble. He couldn't do nothing as the monster would eventually sniff him out. On the other hand, the moment he tried to teleport away, his location would almost certainly be completely blown. 10 seconds later, with the spider getting ever closer and no solution in sight, Zorian decided he would just have to work fast and pray for the best. Taking a deep breath to calm himself down, he started casting the teleport spell as fast as he could. As he feared, the Grey Hunter reacted instantly. The moment the first word of the chant left his mouth, the spider surged towards him, abandoning its previous jerky, uncertain advance. As it sprinted towards him, it angled away from the explosive glyph cluster Zorian placed on one of the rocks in its path, somehow aware of its existence and function, and launched itself sideways into the air. It landed vertically on the trunk of a nearby tree and immediately launched itself sideways again, bouncing from tree to tree and gaining altitude with each jump, until at last it was both close and high enough to reach Zorian's location. Zorian finished the teleport spell and was whisked away in the nick of time. The terrifying vision of a giant spider sailing through the air towards him, front legs extended and huge black fangs poised for a strike, would haunt his nightmares for days to come. Break. Following his almost lethal encounter with the Grey Hunter, Zorian decided to put Silver Lake's quest on indefinite hold. There were plenty of other people that Kale listed as possible help after all, and maybe if he talked to her in some other restart and tried again she'd send him on a less suicidal quest. It was very frustrating though. The thought of how thoroughly he had been outclassed by what was fundamentally a dumb beast brought to mind the memory of that final restart in Cyoria when he clashed with Red Robe in the ruins of the Iranian settlement. The fact that the Grey Hunter was a giant spider just like the Irania, further brought to mind uncomfortable parallels. Despite the fact that he knew intellectually that there was no shame in losing to a creature that even famous mages would balk at facing, and that he should in fact be happy to even be alive, he found himself very bothered at his ineffectiveness. He spent the next day by tracking down giant trapdoor spiders, which were of similar size to Grey Hunters but brown-colored and a hell of a lot less dangerous, before smoking them out of their holes and then killing them in a variety of painful fashions. Their eyes and venom glands sold a lot better than winter wolf pelts too. He should do that more often. Still somewhat in a foul mood, he set out to see if any of Kale's other contacts were able and willing to help him. When he arrived in the village where his first candidate lived and was informed by the locals that the man hadn't been seen in the past 2 months, he was unconcerned. The man was a retired mage fascinated with familiars. He had 6 of them as well as a great number of more mundane pets, and was always looking to add another exotic creature to his menagerie. An absence of 2 months was a bit unusual, but not something to immediately raise an alarm about. But then other disappearances started piling up. The old herbalist lady that also sometimes removed curses was simply gone, and her neighbors had no idea where she went. The 2 brothers that lived in a tower they built away from civilization and secretly studied soul magic were not present at their home, the gate to their tower broken and the inside stripped bare of anything worthwhile. The priest in the nearby town dedicated to studying the undead and ways to fight them had been found dead in his home 4 days ago, cause of death unknown. He was young and had no known medical problems or addictions, so foul play was suspected. An alchemist specializing in transformation magic was torn apart outside his village by a pack of unusually aggressive boars. And so on. Only the priest and the alchemist were actually confirmed dead, the others having gone on sudden business trips or just plain gone missing one day, and the disappearances were in a sufficiently large area that no one seemed to have connected them in a single pattern, but Zorian knew this was not accidental. Someone was deliberately targeting anyone who had some sort of knowledge on soul magic. The only question was whether the missing people were dead or just kidnapped for some purpose. Thankfully, he finally managed to locate one of the people Kale mentioned to him. Unfortunately, the man in question didn't actually know any soul magic. Vani was just a scholar and according to Kale could probably point him towards someone who does. Probably. The only trick was that Vani liked to talk, meandering from topic to topic as he pleased, and he would refuse to help anyone who was in any way impolite with him. Thus, anyone seeking him out for advice had to be very patient and ready for frequent digressions. Zorian could do patient. He knocked on the door to the man's home and was promptly ushered inside by Vane. a cheerful older man with a receding hairline who was not at all surprised that someone sought him out for advice. The inside was packed. That was the only word that fit, really. Almost every inch of the house was filled with boxes, shelves and pedestals that held books, statues big and small, plants and animals preserved in bottles, glass cases that held tiny models or buildings and other such things. Where the walls were visible, they were usually filled with paintings and drawings. As Vana led them both into his study, Zorian's view fell on a particularly large and lifelike statue of a naked woman with some rather bountiful assets, and he quirked an amused eyebrow at the man. "It's a air goddess of fertility sort of thing," the man hastened to explain. "Just a temporary thing, a friend of mine sent it to me for safekeeping and you know how it goes. Fascinating stuff. Anyway, don't think I don't know who you are, young man. You're the one who has been killing all the winter wolves in the region lately." Is that a problem?" Zorian asked. "Problem," the man laughed. "Just the opposite. Finally someone did something to cull those awful beasts a little. They're not too bad right now, but come winter they get aggressive and start assaulting travelers and outlying communities. There's been a number of child disappearances the last few winters, and everyone knows it's probably the winter wolves at fault. Damn things get bolder with every passing year." "How come nobody organized a hunting party yet then?" asked Zorian. The Mage Guild was pretty much founded to respond to situations like this after all. It snows pretty heavily here in winter and whole towns can sometimes get cut off from the rest of the world for days, so it's hard to marshal a response in time. Most of the time no one even finds out there was a crisis until days afterwards, when nothing can be done. Vani tapped the table with his fingers contemplatively as if considering something. Or at least that's what the hunters and the authorities like to say. "Personally, I just think they're afraid of the Silver One." "Silver One?" asked Zorian curiously. "It's a rumor. A few years back, when the winter wolves first started acting up, there was an attempt to organize a wide-scale cull and a large hunting party was organized. It ended poorly. According to stories, several winter wolf packs worked together to lure the hunters into traps, separating them into smaller groups that were then defeated in detail. They acted more like an army than a group of wild animals, and survivors claimed they were led by a huge winter wolf with a shiny silver pelt. The Silver One, an alpha of alphas, as smart as any man and with the power to direct his lesser brothers against humans. There was an official attempt by the Eldamar's Mage Guild to locate and eliminate this winter wolf, but they found nothing, neither the silver wolf nor any evidence of multiple packs working together. A lot of the locals are still convinced he exists, though they say that anyone who goes after the wolves ends up getting confronted by it sooner or later." "I see," frowned Zorian. "And what do you think?" "It's possible, I suppose," admitted Vani. "We live in a crazy world and you can never really say that something is impossible. Could be a runaway experiment made by some crazy mage in the forest. It could be a new species originating from the heart of winter. It could even be a polymorphed mage on some deranged crusade to protect the bloodthirsty monsters from those terrible humans. All I know is that I'm glad someone is not getting intimidated by all the scaremongering floating around." It took another 15 minutes till Vani decided to even ask what Zorian came to him for. "Kale sent me," Zorian said. "Or rather, he listed your name as a possible source of advice." "Kale?" Vani said happily. "Oh, I remember him. Shame about what happened to his wife and mother-in-law. The weeping took so many great people from us. He still has his daughter though, doesn't he?" Zorian nodded. "Good. Children are the greatest treasure. Tell him I said that. He helped me write a book, you know." "Did he tell you that?" "He did," Zorian confirmed. Kale had warned him that Vani was a little vain and loved discussing his books, and that it might be a good idea to read one or two. Zorian took this advice and read 2 of them. The first one, the one that Kale had helped the man write by gathering the accounts of various people in the region, was about the recent history of the region and was mostly a collection of anecdotes, some interesting and amusing and some of them mind-numbingly boring. If it weren't for Kale's advice, he never would have gone past the first chapter. I even read it as well as one other book. Oh. It was titled History of Pre-Icosian Altazia, Zorian said, considering whether to tell the man the truth or to simply flatter him. He decided to go with the truth for now. It was kind of interesting, but I don't really agree with the lot of it. My principal complaint is that you keep talking about pre-Icosian tribes living on Altazia as if they had lived in total vacuum, when the reality was that the entire southern coast of Altazia was dotted with Icosian colonies and forts stretching back for at least 1,000 years. Icosians were hardly the total aliens to Altazia that you portray them as in your work. But the historical evidence clearly shows that the cultural influence of those coastal states didn't extend very far inland, pointed out Vani triumphantly. That may be strictly true, but Icosians were vastly more technologically advanced than Altazian tribes in most areas, and I think you're greatly underestimating the effect of simple technological diffusion on people's culture. Yeah. This was probably going to take a while. Break. Thank you for that, Vana said. They had been talking for several hours at that point, and Vana seemed surprisingly pleased to have met someone who disagreed with his conclusions and was willing to talk about it. Zorian also found out that the man was incredibly well-read and seemed to have memorized half a dozen encyclopedias, because he was a font of various trivia. Whatever he thought about the man's conclusions, he clearly hadn't arrived on them on a whim. It's been a while since I had this kind of discussion with someone. Usually the kind of people willing to talk to me don't know enough to challenge me, and the ones that do know enough aren't interested in talking. You flatter me. I don't really think my opinions have the same weight as yours. I certainly haven't done even 100th of the research you did, Zorian said. Never hurt to butter people up a little. But I really shouldn't waste your time for much longer. I came to you because I wanted your advice on how to find an expert in soul magic. Soul magic? The man asked with a frown. It's a personal issue that I'd rather not talk about, Zorian said. Suffice to say I have been hit by a soul magic spell of unknown effects and want to talk to someone about finding out what exactly has been done to me and how to protect myself against any further such events. Vani hummed. And Kale sent you to me? You were on the list of people he said could help me. However, you were the only one I could actually locate. The others were, well, it's very disturbing. Let me tell you about my last couple of days. Vana listened to Zorian's description of disappearances with growing unease, writing down the names and facts that Zorian uncovered on a piece of paper. That is indeed very disturbing, Vani agreed when Zorian was finished. To think that such a thing could happen without everyone realizing it for so long. I will bring this matter to the attention of proper authorities, have no worry about that. It does make me wonder who I can recommend to you when so many of the obvious choices have become, unavailable. Let me think about this a little. 5 minutes later, Vana managed to think up a solution. Tell me, he asked. What do you know about shifters? That they're people who have the ability to turn into animals? Zorian tried. Shifters are people with two souls, Vana said. Long in the past, the ancestors of the shifters enacted rituals that fused their souls with the souls of their chosen animals, allowing them to take the forms of the animals in question and even access some of the abilities of said animals in their human form. It is a very old form of magic that predates the Icosian invasion of Altazia, and I'm sad to say that most shifter tribes have lost the knowledge of the original rituals they used to create their kind. These days they grow in numbers purely through mundane reproduction, with children of shifters inheriting their parents' dual soul. There exist, however, tribes that retain the knowledge of ritual magic and soul mechanics necessary to perform the ritual in the modern age. While the purpose of such expertise is to turn regular humans into new members of the tribe, it may very well be general enough to help you with your issue. I see. And where can I find these shifters? Zorian asked. That, Vana said, spreading his arms in a helpless gesture, I do not know. Shifter tribes have a checkered history with the, shall we say, civilized communities. They rarely want to be found. But I do know that there is a fairly powerful wolf shifter tribe living in this region. A tribe that definitely has the expertise you seek. I do not know who you need to talk to in order to meet with their leadership, but I do know that the leader of the tribe sent his daughter to Cyoria to get an education in more modern forms of magic. Rainy is her name, I think. A redhead. Quite the looker, I'm told. Perhaps you can start there. Zorian blinked. Rainy is a wolf shifter? Yeah, now that he thought about it, there were some things that could point that way. Well, said Zorian, rising from his seat. You gave me a lot to think about. Thank you for your time. Think nothing of it, Vana smiled. Go kill a few more winter wolves for me is all I ask for. Wouldn't a tribe of wolf shifters kind of dislike me for killing so many wolves? Zorian asked. They're wolf shifters, not winter wolf shifters, Vana said. I'm pretty sure they don't like each other much. Winter wolves have a habit of killing their more mundane relatives and invading their territory. Zorian left after that, unsure how to proceed further in the restart. Break. Back already? Silverlake asked him, not bothering to look up from her bundle of herbs while addressing him. I'm not seeing any egg sac on you though. That's because Spider Mommy is carrying her eggs on her underbelly, he said. The task is impossible. Why would you even send me on such a fool's errand? Kale said you were eccentric but ultimately harmless. This isn't harmless. I almost died. If I thought you were the sort to rush in half-cocked and get your fool ass killed by something like that, I never would have sent you on that errand, Silverlake scoffed. And anyway, isn't it a bit premature to declare failure after less than a week? I'm patient. I waited for years, I sure as hell can wait for a few months more till you think of something. You're a smart boy, I'm sure you'll figure out a way. Zorian opened his mouth and then closed it. Suddenly her logic sounded a lot more reasonable to him. She didn't know he was on a month-long time limit after all. As far as she was concerned, giving him a task that would take several months to complete was perfectly logical. Where was the hurry? As for the suicidal nature of the task she gave him, apparently she had more faith in his skills than he himself did. Did he really give up too soon? A few months is too late, he said. Anything that happens after the summer festival might as well not exist for me. Silverlake finally stopped fiddling with the herb pile and gave him a hard look, her eyes glowing brightly for a moment. You're not dying, she stated. Not out of sickness anyway. Someone hunting for you? Zorian hesitated, the image of Red Robe dancing before his eyes, and opened his mouth to say yes. Silverlake cut him off though. No, not really, she stated, going back to her herbs. You have an enemy, but then again, who doesn't? Zorian exhaled in irritation and rose up, deciding to leave before he lost his cool and attacked her. He'd probably get stomped into the ground anyway. Just before he teleported away though, a thought struck him. To hell with it, he thought. Why not? Hypothetically speaking, he said. If you were visited by a time traveler who claimed to know your future self, what would you ask of him as proof? Hypothetically speaking, she said, her mouth stretching into a cruel grin, I would have asked him to retrieve a Grey Hunter egg sac for me. Throwing his hands in the air in defeat, Zorian teleported back to his inn in Nyazovdvary, the cackling of a sadistic old woman echoing behind him. Break. In the safety of the room he rented at the inn, Zorian was sitting on the bed, dismantling a rifle he had bought earlier. It was kind of amusing how easy it was to procure a firearm compared to high-level combat magic aids, despite them being just as lethal, but there you had it. They were especially easy to procure here in Nyazovdvary, which was so close to the wilderness and its dangers. In any case, he was trying to see how the things worked and, more importantly, how they could be enchanted. Firearms were notoriously tricky to enhance with magic. Like all ranged weapons, they had the problem that you could only enchant the device to be more accurate and durable, and if you wanted the projectile to have any sort of magical effect upon striking the target, you had to enchant the projectile itself. Bullets were unfortunately very hard to enchant, being much smaller than arrows and crossbow bolts and usually made from some very magically unsuitable materials. You also couldn't touch the bullet to channel mana into it once it was already in the gun. Though maybe if he installed some crystal mana channels into the gun via alteration. While he studied the device in front of him, Zorian idly considered ways to off the Grey Hunter from earlier. He had no intention of actually trying any of them as they were each more implausible than the last, but there was no harm in coming up with scenarios. Grey Hunters had known weaknesses. First of all, they were purely melee opponents. If you could keep them at a distance, there was nothing they could do to you. The trouble was that they were really good at closing in on their target. Secondly, they were ultimately just magical animals, so they could be lured into prepared traps and kill zones fairly easily. The problem here was that they were fast and tough enough to probably survive such a blunder. The magic sense the Grey Hunter demonstrated in Zorian's first encounter with it probably also helped it avoid the most blatant of such traps. He could think of several ways to trap it, but most of them required knowledge of spells that he didn't have. If he knew how to make a simulacrum and open portals, he could simply send in his simulacrum as bait and then open a portal leading to wherever he set the trap up. Hell, simply knowing how to make a simulacrum would make things a million times easier since he could test his ideas without endangering himself. If he knew large terrain alteration spells, he could simply seal it off in its lair and wait for it to suffocate. If he knew the spells to manipulate large amounts of water, he might be able to drown it. And so on and so on. He also considered poisoning the thing or putting it to sleep or otherwise using some kind of alchemical concoction that would cripple or kill it. But anything potent enough to kill such a beast was heavily restricted, made out of super rare ingredients and expensive as all hell. He didn't know how to make anything like that and couldn't get his hands on something that valuable and forbidden through trade. He could try for brute force and build a golem to take the spider down. Since they were machines animated by magic, they were immune to poison and could be extremely strong enough to crush the stupid spider in a head-to-head fight. Unfortunately, he didn't know how to build a golem. Any golem at all, let alone one good enough to go toe-to-toe with a Grey Hunter. The art of golem making was complicated enough that several houses were dedicated to mastering it, and not something to dabble in for a week or two, or even a month or two. Furthermore, even if he knew how to build it, the process of building would take at least a week and probably more, require a specialized workshop and consume a lot of expensive materials. He would likely bankrupt himself before he was even halfway finished. Which brought him to firearms. The revolver worked well enough against Red Robe when his spells had failed him after all. No regular firearm would do against the Grey Hunter though, he needed something stronger than that. Unfortunately, higher calibers were usually reserved for the military and he would need to raid a military base and steal one if he wanted to go down that route. That could end very badly. Who knew what kind of defenses a military base had, and being captured and interrogated by military investigators while drugged out of his mind on various truth serums was almost as bad as being discovered by a hostile mind mage or a necromancer. Plus, he was pretty sure they had a couple of mind mages and necromancers on the payroll anyway. Oh, and even if he did find something suitable under a lax enough security, there was the matter that it would almost certainly still have to be enchanted and he couldn't even figure out how to effectively enchant a simple rifle at the moment. Probably wouldn't by the end of the restart either. A knock on his door woke him up from his musings and he quickly put the rifle into its box and hid it under the bed. Him owning the rifle wasn't illegal, but he'd still rather not let whomever was looking for him see him tinkering with it. He made sure his shielding bracelet was on just in case and then opened the door. It was Guri, which did not surprise Zorian all that much. The man had been dutifully buying off any of the various alchemical ingredients and assorted body parts Zorian had gathered in the forest and allowed Zorian to use his workshop when he needed to make some of the trickier potions and magic items. The man had already commissioned a couple of magic items from Zorian, so he expected Guri's arrival to be about another commission. As it turned out, Guri had another kind of deal in mind. Once the pleasantries were exchanged, he skipped straight to the point. "I want you to help me rob my rival." Chapter 030. A Game of Shops. "I want you to help me rob my rival." Zorian blinked in surprise before giving the man an incredulous look. "What? And why the hell would I do that?" he asked the man curiously. Guri grinned triumphantly. "I knew I was right about you," he said. "You didn't even pretend to be outraged at the question." Zorian frowned. "I'm just not a very excitable person, that's all. It doesn't mean I'm going to actually help you rob someone," he shot back crankily. "In fact, I can scarcely imagine a situation where I would agree to such a thing. I was just curious what possessed you to broach the topic at all. This isn't some kind of attempt at blackmail, is it?" "Oh no, I'd have to be pretty stupid to try and blackmail a man who hunts winter wolves and giant trapdoor spiders for a living," Guri assured him quickly. "Not that I have anything worthwhile to blackmail you with anyway. No, I just felt I had an interesting deal for you and that I had nothing to lose by making an offer. You don't seem like the sort that would get all high and mighty on me just because I employ a few shady business practices. I figure the worst you'd do is say no." Zorian was silent for a moment. He supposed that Guri had him there. Even if Zorian actually cared to turn Guri in, it would still be his word against Guri's. Proving the man's guilt would be a hassle. Guri would likely get a mere slap on the wrist even if convicted, and it would lead to far greater scrutiny of Zorian's activities by nearby powers than he was comfortable with. All in all, it would mean an entire restart wasted on a pointless crusade that had no meaning inside the time loop and would quite possibly attract the attention of the Academy authorities. Previous restarts had made it clear they were very quick to involve themselves when one of their students had a brush with the law or the police, and he was still technically enrolled there. And if the Academy found out about his whereabouts and activities, it was entirely possible Red Robe would also find out about it through cephalic rats or his other spies. No, even if Guri was planning to murder someone, Zorian would not intervene. A simple theft. Well, he wasn't sure he would actually care all that much even if he wasn't stuck in the time loop, and he certainly didn't care at all now. Well, the answer is definitely no, said Zorian finally. I know that wanderers like me have a reputation of being opportunistic, but I'm afraid my ethics aren't quite as flexible as that. I'm not going to stoop to banditry or burglary or whatever it is that you have in mind for this deal of yours. I don't think you quite understand what I'm talking about here, Guri said. You think I want you to steal something physical and that I'm offering you money in exchange, yes? Zorian raised an eyebrow at him. Nothing could be further from the truth. Guri shook his head. I know better than anyone that you're raking in too much money at the moment to be tempted by petty burglary. Ethics aside, that's too much risk for too little gain. No, if this operation goes off without a hitch, and I think you're capable enough to pull it off, there will be nothing missing and no indication that a crime has occurred at all. He leaned towards Zorian conspiratorially and whispered the next part. You see, what I'm trying to steal is not material wealth, but secrets. Well, that changed things considerably. He still didn't want to have anything to do with Guri's deal, but he at least understood why the man felt comfortable discussing such an offer with him. Spying on other mages was technically illegal, but everyone knew it was a common and universal practice. Hell, according to some stories, every noble house worth its name had its own division dedicated just to that. You just had to make sure that you weren't caught. Even the academy, which generally tried to give students a very rose-tinted version of mage culture, admitted that such professional espionage occurred all the time. Some of it was entirely legal, such as analyzing a rival's products and spell work with divination spells, or poring over publicly available documents to see if they'd let something sensitive slip by without noticing. But such legal methods were usually very limited and mages often resorted to shadier methods. Bribing assistants and apprentices into selling out their master's secrets, hiring burglars to raid archives and research notes, dedicated scrying campaigns, seduction plots. The possibilities were endless and new ones were devised every day, as well as countermeasures for such. Zorian recalled a particular fable that spoke of two mages that spent years devising ways to steal each other's secrets and thwarting the other's attempts to do the same to them. Eventually, after a decade of back and forth, they both succeeded in reaching each other's inner sanctum at the same time, only to find out that neither had any secrets worth stealing. They had spent so much time and effort trying to one-up each other that they'd never gotten any actual work done. Well, that was an obvious exaggeration, but it honestly wouldn't surprise Zorian to find out that every magical business, and probably quite a few non-magical ones, in Nyazov Dveri did do at least a little bit of illegal espionage as a matter of course. The world of business was a cutthroat environment. Zorian knew from his parents' stories that even seemingly simple and honest farmers were willing to renege on their contracts if they thought they could get away with it. To someone like Guri, this sort of thing was probably just business as usual. But it wasn't business as usual for Zorian. And frankly, Guri was completely right when he said that the whole thing was a huge risk for little gain. He opened his mouth to give Guri a firm but polite refusal, but was interrupted when Guri pushed a brown leather-bound book in his hands. Zorian looked at the book in surprise for a second, idly wondering why it had no title before giving Guri a searching look. The man motioned him to open it. Zorian did and promptly found himself leafing through pages of handwritten notes and complicated diagrams. It was a journal of some sort. That's why the book had no title or markings. A research journal of some mage if he had to guess. What is this? He asked, giving Guri a suspicious look. A sample, Guri said with a grin. As I said, I know it would be foolish of you to do something like this for money. Well, for the sums I am able to pay you at least, so I came up with something that will hopefully be more attractive to you. Feel free to peruse that thing at your leisure and then come see me in my store tomorrow to give me an answer. Just remember there is more where that came from. Guri then immediately left, leaving Zorian alone with the mysterious journal/thing. Curious, he opened the book at the beginning so he could see if it perhaps had a title written on the first page. The first few pages were blank, but he did reach the title page in the end. Breaking and Bypassing Wards and Other Magical Defenses, it said. By Aldwin Rafolton. Rafolton? That would be Guri's deceased business partner, wouldn't it? Intrigued, Zorian sat down on the edge of his bed and began to read. Break. Having read through Rafolton's book, Zorian had to admit he was feeling a little underwhelmed. It wasn't a bad book by any means, but by the way Guri had presented it, he'd expected more. As it was, the most useful thing he found inside was the step-by-step instruction of how to build your very own magic analysis goggles, complete with a spell formula blueprint. That was convenient, as he had been meaning to build one of those for a while now, and there were no publicly available creation manuals on the topic that he could find. The spell formula blueprint alone probably saved him a restart worth of work. Other than that, there was little of real use in there. But perhaps that was what Guri had been aiming for. It was a sample, as he said, meant to entice Zorian into cooperation by alluding to the possibility of granting Zorian access to the rest of Rafulton's books. If Guri's old partner had 5 other books like that and each one had just one useful thing like the goggle thing, that was a couple of months of saved time right there. And if Guri was keeping the good stuff for the end like Zorian suspected, tempting. Far more tempting than he'd thought this would be. Shaking his head at his own greed, he locked his room behind him and set off in the direction of Guri's shop. He would have to check with the man what exactly he expected of him, but chances were he was going to say yes. In truth, this sort of thing wasn't that far off from what he had been planning to do on his own at some point. Chances were that he was going to have to learn how to break into people's homes and spy on mages sooner or later. Gathering information about the time loop, red robe and soul magic was bound to require it at some point. At least this way he would get some guidance from someone who'd done it before, get a chance to practice his skills on what was probably a far less difficult target and get paid for it to boot. Realizing he was in no hurry to actually confront Guri, Zorian eventually slowed down and decided to take the scenic route to the place. He idly observed the people and buildings as he wandered the town, suddenly aware that he knew very little about the place, despite living in it for a while now. He had been so busy with other things that actually exploring Nyazov very sort of slipped his mind. He didn't even peruse the town's dungeon access, though that one was intentional. He had decided to hold back on doing that until he had a chance to judge how much of his time and attention his other tasks in this restart would take, and ultimately decided to leave that for some other restart. The dungeon wasn't going anywhere. In any case, now that he had taken the time to explore the town a little, he could say with some certainty that he hadn't missed much. He had already visited most of the shops to determine what the best price for the ingredients he was gathering was, and aside from that the town was fairly average. It was similar to Cyoria in the sense that it was clearly a city that had experienced rapid growth in recent times. The old core of the city was easily recognizable by the single-story buildings painted in the traditional yellow color that usually signified Eldamar's native architecture, while subsequent layers radiating from it had newer, multi-story buildings. Other than that, he hadn't noticed anything particularly noteworthy, though he would have to set aside some days for exploration just to be certain. Finally, he reached the building that proudly proclaimed it housed a business establishment known as Quilly and Rafulton Equipment and walked inside. The little bell attached to the door rang out as Zorian entered, notifying Guri of his arrival, a solution surprisingly devoid of magic for a magic store, and the portly man soon poked his head from the back room he was currently in to see what he was dealing with. His eyes lit up immediately when he recognized Zorian. "I'll be with you in a second," the man yelled before getting back to whatever he was working on in the back. Zorian took the chance to study the shop a bit while he waited. Just like the first time he had been here, he was once again struck by how diverse the products sold by Guri's store were. He offered everything from wilderness-appropriate attire to the various magic items, potions, survival guides, dried herbs and other magical materials used by alchemists and artificers and so on. And actually it was even more impressive than it first appeared. Zorian knew from his previous talks with the man that Guri actually offered a great deal more than what was displayed at the shelves of his store, so long as the customer seeking them was properly vouched for or knew how to ask the right questions. Guri once told a story about a customer who tried to buy the decorative potted plants he strategically placed around the shop to liven up the place. And while Zorian understood Guri's mirth at the incident, he also understood how someone might have decided they were for sale. With all the other things Guri was selling, it really wouldn't have surprised Zorian to find out that he dealt in potted plants as well. "Ah, Zorian, my friend," said Guri, walking out from the back and approaching him. "Did you read it? An interesting book, isn't it?" he prodded. "It was somewhat useful," said Zorian noncommittally. "Not much on its own, but if there really are a couple more where that came from, it might actually be worthwhile for me to work with you on your problem." Guri frowned, apparently expecting him to be more impressed with his partner's work. He opened his mouth to speak, but Zorian interrupted him. "Before we discuss this any further, I'd prefer if we move to somewhere more private. Do you have a room I could set up some basic privacy wards in?" "I have better," Guri said smugly, quickly shaking off his previous disappointment. I have a room with privacy wards already present. And not just the basic ones either. Follow me. He led Zorian to a small, inconspicuous room with a single desk and 2 chairs. A room whose walls, floor and ceiling were full of magical glyphs and geometric shapes made out of crystallized mana. Guri placed his hand on one of the circles and the whole complicated spell formula pulsed twice in bright blue light before becoming seemingly inert. Zorian wasn't fooled though. Those pulses signified the more mana-intensive portions of the ward scheme becoming active. Much like many powerful warding schemes, the one he was looking at had 2 modes. The normal, mana-conserving one that could be powered indefinitely from its mana source, and the advanced, supercharged one that burned through mana faster than the ambient mana levels could provide it with but was far more effective for the time it was active. The sound of Guri clearing his throat jolted him out of his thoughts and he realized he had been studying the wards for quite a while now. Oops. Is this one also somewhat useful? Asked Guri with a smirk when he realized he had Zorian's attention again. No, this is quite impressive, Zorian admitted. Is this also made by your former partner? Yes, Guri nodded. He was quite good at this. Setting up wards, I mean. Also breaking and bypassing them, but I understand those 2 are related. Learn how to make a ward and you're 90% there to figuring out how to defeat it. That's the conventional wisdom, yes, agreed Zorian. He decided not to dance around the issue any longer. So, I'm guessing your former partner was your go-to person for these kinds of deals in the past. And now that he's dead, you need to find someone else to do your dirty work. You're direct, Guri laughed nervously. But you've hit the nail on the head more or less. You see, magic was never my thing, as strange as that may sound from an owner of a magic shop. That was always Aldwin's thing. He was the one that worried about the spellcasting part of the business while I was always more comfortable on the more mundane, civilian side of things. Making contacts, closing deals, finding new business partners, that kind of thing. I'm a really terrible mage when it comes down to it. I can barely cast anything at all. Zorian gave him a curious look. I'm pretty sure I saw you manipulate mana plenty of times, and activating the greater privacy mode of this room couldn't have possibly been a matter of just channeling mana into that circle. Oh, I was always very good at using magic items, Guri said. You don't need to be a proper mage to do that. Lots of practice and some specialized shaping exercises and you're set. If you're fairly wealthy like me and live on a mana well, you can even commission items that draw power from the ambient mana instead of from my own minuscule reserves. But we both know there are severe drawbacks to such items, and this sort of job really needs a proper spellcaster. Zorian nodded. He had been considering the possibility of using self-casting magic items to make up for his below-average mana reserves for a while now, but there were a lot of problems with it. The core inescapable issue was that souls of spellcasters were pretty damn good at spellcasting, while even the best-made magic items weren't. Making an item that allowed the caster to skip some of the steps during spellcasting was simple enough, but creating something that was capable of casting a spell entirely on its own upon command? Hard. Possibly very hard or even impossible depending on what spell you were trying to imprint into the item. Warding schemes and one-use magic items like his suicide explosive cubes got around the issue by having the maker cast the spell during creation, after which the spell formula simply stabilized it and kept it from degrading, but that workaround wasn't very useful for the majority of spells. And then there was the issue of powering said items. Not every place had much in the way of ambient mana, and even places that did often couldn't provide the amount necessary for the spell at once. That meant that most self-casting items needed an internal mana battery, which brought a whole host of problems of its own. No battery was totally efficient and reliable. They all leaked mana in varying amounts and could easily blow up if overcharged or poorly constructed. And that was without even getting into the number of actual combat spells that were specifically designed to make mana batteries blow up from internal pressure. All in all, the creation of self-casting items was something that Zorian put squarely into the probably not worth it category. He wasn't nearly good enough with spell formula currently to pull it off, and even if he were, it was still a very difficult subfield of magic item creation that gave very dubious gains. Though he did eventually intend to track down a blueprint for a blasting rod. Probably the simplest of self-casting items that blasted whatever it was pointed at with a torrent of barely constrained energy, usually fire. A fittingly named item and one of the few self-casting items that was known to be reliable and effective in actual combat, at least at close range. It was not a priority, however. Such an item would be more of a last resort, sidearm sort of weapon than something to build his skills around. I'm not as useless at this sort of cloak and dagger stuff as you might think though, Guri said. As I said, Aldwin was the spellcaster, but I was the one who identified the targets. You can't spy on a threat unless you know they are a threat after all. And I was always very good at spotting who our competition was and keeping an eye on their activities. People underestimate how much information you can get simply by being well connected and giving a few expensive gifts to people. You mean bribes, said Zorian. Zorian, my friend, you have much to learn, Guri said, shaking his head. Bribes are illegal. There is no law against generosity. Giving that bottle of expensive wine to your drinking buddy or inviting someone to that fancy annual dance that they've always wanted to attend is just being nice and no one can prove otherwise. Right, Zorian sighed. I guess I shouldn't talk since I'm willing to go along with your plans. And speaking of which, why don't we get back to the reason we're here in the first place? What exactly do you want from me and what are you offering? Very well. I presume you know about Vazen's General Store? The biggest magic-related shop in town, asked Zorian. That one, yes. Quilly and Rafulton equipment was once bigger and able to compete with them on a more equal footing, but since the death of my partner 2 years ago those days have passed. Recently they have closed a deal with another company from Scioria, but they have been silent about the contents of the deal. Everyone knows they have bought a bunch of spell formula schematics, alchemical recipes and production licenses, so it's obvious they intend to seriously branch out into the production side of the business, but the exact details have been successfully kept secret. That is a problem. Depending on what Vazen intends to produce, some things are going to decline sharply in value, while the price of the raw materials used to make them goes up to a similar degree. I see. You need to see what your rival will release so that you can prepare for the impact it will have on the market, mused Zorian. Well, that and so that I can see if it is possible to counter his move in some fashion, Guri said. I suppose you know where I can find that information? Zorian asked. Not in the shop itself, I hope. That place is bound to be heavily warded. It's not nearly as warded as you might think. Some basic counters to stop teleportation and divination, and that's about it. But the place is always manned even during the night, so you're right that they're not something you'd want to tangle with. Fortunately, you don't have to. In the end, Vazen's own paranoia is his undoing. I have found out that instead of keeping the documents in his heavily guarded shop, he has brought them into his much less protected home. Apparently, he doesn't even trust his own employees. How protected is his home? Asked Zorian. Well, my information might be a little outdated since I got it 2.5 years ago from my then-living partner who scouted the entire building, but I doubt much has changed. It has an anti-divination ward and all the doors and windows have intruder alarms and that's it. The documents themselves are kept in a safe, though, and that is bound to have much more serious defenses. Not too bad of a setup, to be honest, Zorian said after thinking about it for a minute. The divination ward stops casual espionage and makes it impossible to just scry and teleport inside, while the alarms on entrances make it impossible to simply sneak inside without magic. Covering only the entrances with the wards was a common mana-conserving measure. True, it made the wards useless if the attackers could phase through walls or were willing to make their own entrance by blowing a hole in the building, but thieves capable of phasing through solid matter had bigger fish to fry than robbing small-time shop owners, and blasting holes in the walls would kind of defeat the point of trying to acquire the information undetected. You can teleport though, right? Asked Guri. I mean, I'm sure you can. The speed of movement over large distances that you've demonstrated pretty much requires it. But how good are you at it? I can teleport, Zorian said hesitantly. He didn't think he was making it that obvious, though he supposed he couldn't keep leaving in the morning and coming back before the sun set with things only found deep in the forest without someone questioning just how he was doing it. I'm getting pretty good at it, in my opinion. It takes me a while to shape the spell, but I can consistently pull it off. Excellent. The intruder alarms shouldn't be much of a problem then, Guri said with a grin. Aldwin had this neat trick where he could turn an item into a teleport beacon of sorts, and then simply teleport himself to its location without having to have been there in the past. I'm sure I can get some innocuous-seeming thing through the door, you just have to cast the spell on it. I don't know how to cast the spell myself, but Aldwin did write it down in one of his journals. Spell, you say? No spell formula involved? Asked Zorian curiously. No spell of recall, I think it's called. It's a 2-part spell. You first cast a personal teleport beacon on an item, and it immediately forges a connection between you and it. You can then cast the second spell at any time, causing yourself to be recalled at the location of the item. According to Aldwin, it was meant to be used for rapid escape. You cast the first spell on a retreat point and then use the second spell to teleport there if you end up in a bind. Why not use a regular teleport for that? Frowned Zorian. Sounds like a lot of trouble when a normal teleport will suffice. After all, you've already been to the location you're teleporting to if you're setting it up as a retreat point. I really don't know. You will have to find that out yourself if you're interested, Guri said. So assuming the spell works as advertised and you can smuggle something in like you said you would, I just have to defeat the protection on the safe to get to the documents. Yes. That part will be all you since I have no idea where it is or what protections it has, confirmed Guri. Zorian stared at the man for a while before taking a deep breath. Lovely. Unfortunately for you, I am not the professional ward breaker you seem to think I am, he told Guri. When you said you wanted my help with this, I had thought I would just play support or something. Something like this is, to put it bluntly, out of my league. I'm sorry, but unless there is something you're not telling me, there is no way I'd be able to pull this off. Guri leaned forward and gave him a conspiratorial grin. Even if I gave you Aldwin's spellbook and his notes on how the spells are meant to be used? Zorian blinked. What? 2 hours later, Zorian left Guri's shop with 3 new books under his arm. They had agreed to make the attempt at the documents 3 days before the summer festival, ostensibly to give Zorian the time he needed to practice the spells in Aldwin's spellbook, but also because that way, should the whole thing go pear-shaped, Zorian would only lose 3 days of the restart. Zorian hummed to himself in satisfaction as he walked back to the inn. It was nice to catch a windfall from time to time. After the whole annoyance with Silver Lake and the mysterious disappearance of soul magic practitioners, he had begun to think that this whole restart had been a giant waste of time. Now, well, at least he'd gotten some shiny new spells out of it, ones of the sort that he could never have acquired through any legal avenue. Things were looking up. After his talk with Guri, time passed quickly. It was difficult to practice the spells found in Aldwin's spellbook, as most of them only interacted with wards and required an actual warding scheme as a target. Thankfully, Zorian had managed to find a warded house whose owner had left on a trip, allowing Zorian to practice on it to his heart's content, provided he kept out of sight of the main road. He also occasionally warded objects himself for practice purposes, usually when practicing the more destructive spells, but that just wasn't the same as interacting with an unknown ward. Surprisingly, Guri was also willing to have Zorian practice the spells on his shop's warding scheme, so long as he didn't do anything permanent. Zorian wondered about that. All things considered, Guri was being far too accommodating to him. He suspected that the portly man thought of him as an investment and hoped to turn him into a more long-term asset, and as such was rather more generous to Zorian than he otherwise would have been, but he had no way to be sure. There did not seem to be anything malicious about it, so he mostly ignored it and tried to be simply grateful for his good fortune. There were essentially 3 ways of dealing with wards. The first one was to starve the ward out, depriving it of mana until it simply fell apart. The second was to identify a way to disrupt its structure, causing it to fail on the spot. And finally, the third one was to trick it into not activating in the first place. Siphoning, breaking, and bypassing were the terms used in literature for the 3 methods. Each one had its advantages and disadvantages, but for the task Guri entrusted him, he would have to rely on bypassing the wards on the safe. Siphoning had the advantage that it always worked. Every ward could be siphoned to death with enough time and effort. It was just a question if the attacker was willing to devote the necessary resources for the task. Some wards could last for months after being isolated from their power sources, even when actively drained of mana during the isolation. Unfortunately, it required that the attacker have complete control of the area around the ward. As siphoning operations were difficult to set up and maintain, anything less than total control made it too easy for the defender to wreck the setup. It was mostly used for sieges and bringing down legacy wards that had outlived their usefulness. Breaking was the fastest method of neutralizing wards. Just disrupt the structure of the ward and let it collapse on itself. Unfortunately, many wards collapsed explosively or had other unpleasant side effects if simply broken, often resulting in the destruction of the warded thing and sometimes the one doing the breaking as well. A lot of wards were also simply too powerful to be broken by a single mage, or even a group of mages, unless the attacker had identified a particularly glaring weakness. So all in all, breaking a ward was often not possible, and even more often, not desirable even if the possibility existed. Still, if one wanted to get rid of a ward quickly and had power to spare, breaking the ward was the way to go. Finally, there was bypassing the wards, the preferred way of dealing with them if at all possible. If the attacker knew how the ward functioned, either because he had been given access to the schematics of the warding scheme or because he had analyzed its structure via divination spells, they could take care not to activate any of the triggers that made the ward recognize there was a problem to be countered. Depending on how the ward functioned, it might even be possible to put additional layers on top of it to neutralize it completely. If an attacker wanted to keep their intrusion secret, bypassing the wards was a must, as it was the only method that left the wards intact after they were done. Since the idea was to leave no trace of his home invasion, he obviously couldn't break or siphon the wards on the safe. He had to trick his way past them and leave them intact. There were lots of ways to do that in the books Guri had given him, since Aldwin was primarily interested in that sort of solution to the wards himself. But until Zorian took an actual look at the safe, he couldn't tell which ones he should use. So he settled on simply practicing all of them. As the date of the summer festival approached, Zorian decided to visit Vani one more time to see if the man had any news on the missing soul mages. He didn't, though he admitted he hadn't tried to find out anything about that very hard. It was a matter for law enforcement, Vani had claimed, and getting involved would just paint them as suspects. He was probably right, and Zorian knew there was no point in snooping around now that the case was being investigated by the police. But he definitely intended to launch a personal investigation in future restarts to see what was going on there. Vani had asked him whether he had found the Shifter tribe, but Zorian admitted that he sort of gave up on that. He couldn't go to Rainey as she was in Cyoria, and nobody else could direct him where to go. Or maybe they could but didn't want to. The result was the same in either case. Besides, he was skeptical in regard to how much they could actually help with his issue. Finally, the day had come. Guri had managed to get a small plaque inside Vazen's house by stuffing it inside an envelope and mailing it to the man along with some ridiculous advertisement. Zorian couldn't believe that had actually worked, but it had, and now they just had to wait for the man to go to work before he could teleport inside and search for the safe. Vazen was a 40-year-old bachelor, so there was supposed to be no one in the house with him gone, but Zorian had prepared a set of concealing clothes for himself anyway, that he intended to throw away immediately after the operation, and was willing to teleport out at the first sign of trouble. After an hour of waiting, Vazen left the house and Zorian teleported inside. Guri remained outside under an invisibility field, acting as a lookout. If he spotted Vazen coming back, he would press a button on the stopwatch Zorian had given him, which would cause a ring on Zorian's hand to heat up. The house was, thankfully, completely empty, but also completely lacking in safes, warded or otherwise. Even after he'd added an additional layer to the wards in order to exclude the inside of the house from the anti-divination ward, his spells still gave no results. Probably because the safe was itself warded against divinations. Frustrating. It was obviously hidden behind something, but Zorian couldn't figure out where. There were no hollow walls, secret hatches beneath the carpet, places where the floor was scraped due to constant movement of furniture and so on. Just as Zorian was about to give up and hit the books for an exotic divination spell that could work despite the ward, he finally found it. It was in the fireplace of all things. If he hadn't noticed how relatively clean it was, and reminisced about how much he hated cleaning the one back home in Siren, it would have never occurred to him to look there. The fireplace was not built for convenient access, so interacting with it was rather annoying. The safe was positioned to the left, making it impossible to actually see the lock without the use of a mirror. Still, that was just an inconvenience, not a real obstacle. He began casting analysis spells at the ward that protected the safe, trying to find a way past them. He had just enough time to register that there was a very weak, localized ward present in the fireplace before he was forced to jump back and erect a shield in front of him. A deafening explosion erupted from the fireplace, enveloping the whole room in blinding, choking ash as the ward triggered the explosive trap in response to detecting his analysis spell. His shield protected him from the blast, but the ash cloud was hell on his lungs. He teleported out, grabbed Guri and then teleported again, this time away from Vazen's house. The operation was a bust. Break. In the aftermath of the botched operation, the whole idea had been scrapped. Security was bound to go up now that Vaesen knew there was someone after the documents. And Zorian didn't fancy going against the new and improved defenses when even the old ones nearly killed him. Guri was, if anything, even more shaken about the whole thing than Zorian was. He apologized profusely for the whole episode and ranted about how such lethal traps were illegal and how he couldn't believe Vaesen would employ such a thing, which Zorian found more than a little amusing. It helped explain why Vaesen seemingly didn't bother to report the break-in to the police, though. Personally, Zorian was feeling pretty annoyed with himself. Despite what Guri seemed to think, this was all on him. He really should have checked the fireplace for traps. Hell, he should have checked the whole house for those. Just because Guri had said there were no other defenses didn't mean he should have taken it for granted. The man had even said his information was outdated. Well, no matter, he got some nifty spells out of the whole thing and he knew what to watch out for in subsequent restarts. He thought about confronting the Grey Hunter at the end of the restart, but then decided against it. He would have just died messily and he'd had enough brushes with death in this particular restart. He went to sleep and woke up with his sister wishing him a good morning.